We're out South by. This is crazy. What's going on? All right, so thank you for coming, everybody. I'm really excited to present this awesome panel of badass all-stars. So we are going to be talking about being a Muslim reporter and talking about Islam while also being Muslims who practice Islam and how that could be complicated and difficult to do, especially when it feels like everybody has their own ideas of what Islam is and how it's practiced around the world. So we have these all-stars, these awesome badass reporters to my left. The first one is Rowaida Abdelaziz. I wrote a bio for her, so I'm going to read it. Rowaida is a journalist at the Huffington Post. She focuses on Islamophobia and the Muslim experience in the US. And she launched the Huffington Post Islamophobia Tracker last year, and it tracks anti-Muslim rhetoric in public. Next is Malika Bilal. She joins us from DC. She is an international news journalist and TV host and moderator at Al Jazeera. She's currently the digital producer and co-host for The Stream. And she's Emmy nominated, so, you know, she's pretty awesome.
Correction, this show is, but I'll take it. I'll take it.
It counts.
It does.
And last but not least, we have Aisha Siddiqui. She's joining us from LA, and she is a Pakistani-American writer and television developer, formerly in director of development of Viceland, and now she's currently a creative consultant specializing in trend forecasting. So, thank you so much, everybody, for coming. Very, very beautiful. So I want to first start with you, Rowaida. You obviously are a Muslim. So tell me, do you ever feel like you have a responsibility to represent Islam and your community?
That's a great question, and I think it's something that Muslim women in particular have been battling in the public sphere, specifically hijab-wearing Muslim women. Policing of hijab Muslim women is a hobby for many, and I think it becomes problematic when we associate a person's actions to being a brand ambassador for the religion. And I think that leads to different issues of just Muslim women in particular not being able to express themselves fully, being who they are, expressing their opinions. One of the stories I was working on, a series of cases of road rages happening on the road when Muslim women, particularly when they were driving. And oftentimes, these Muslim women would get so frustrated and they would want to flip them off or curse out this driver, right? And then the main reason that stopped them, they were just like, this person's going to associate me as a Muslim person being angry and not just like a random angry New Yorker. Yeah. And that was so frustrating to her. And she was like, I know it's small, I know it's stupid, and I feel like I can't be who I am, just an angry New Yorker driver, because I have to put up this image of Muslim women are nice and smiley and pretty and pleasant. So I think there is that issue of being a brand ambassador. And I think that also falls onto journalists, unfortunately. And I think sometimes that leads to issues that I know we're going to discuss later of tokenization. And Muslim journalists are expected to focus on, Muslim-related issues, even if they don't want to. So I think it's a dark rabbit hole that we can talk about for a very long time, but I'm going to pass that along to you.
No, I totally echo those sentiments. And I will say also that I'll start this off by saying I think representation matters. I think it matters to young little girls when they turn on their television screens or open up their computers and they get to see people that look like them. Especially, I'm focusing on little girls because of the underrepresentation of women, Black women, and Muslim women in our today's society and today's media. But it matters for everyone. It matters for little boys. It matters for members of the LGBTQI community. It matters for people to be able to see representations of themselves. That said, I shy away from headlines that say things like, first hijabi woman shatters this stereotype, behind the veil, Muslim woman wearing scarf does this. And it's because, for me personally, as a person who wears a scarf and hosts a television show available in 350 million households around the world, I am not doing it because I wear a scarf. And I am not on air reporting on stories from everything from border walls to refugee crisis because I'm Muslim. I'm doing it because I'm a reporter and I'm a journalist, and that's what I trained to do. And so to simply put that label on, it almost minimizes what I'm trying to do, and it takes away from the story. I'm not the story. I'm the person reporting the story. The story is whatever it is that I'm trying to amplify. So I shy away from that label, but I also understand the reason we have it.
Absolutely, and I'm so glad you both said what you said, because first of all, brand ambassador is such an apt analogy for what Muslims get burdened with. I mean, it's safe to say that Islam has the worst PR in the world as far as religions go. Yeah. And a lot of that is a result of the kind of appetite for specific narratives about us. And it seems that people are only interested in Muslim women to the extent that they're seen as shattering something, like shattering stereotypes, as you just mentioned. And that's because there's an appetite for narratives that affirm this idea that anything that we do accomplish, it's in spite of being Muslim, and it's something that we have to overcome in order to do anything in our lives. And that's very frustrating, because those headlines, and I share your distaste for them, are premised on the idea that there's something inherently conservative, provincial, outmoded about our faith practice that stands in the way of us living our lives as fully realized women. And the pressure to constantly unpack that assumption is not only exhausting, it's a waste, because if shattering stereotypes and myth-busting about Islam worked, we wouldn't still be doing it. I mean, it's 2018, and that's the subject of our panel, but these are panels we've all been doing for years, and myth-busting about Islam and, you know, unpacking stereotypes for people, that's been going on for my entire adult life, and even before then in classrooms when teachers would ask me about how I could be Muslim and insert any other noun afterwards.
Yeah, it gets even more complicated when we end up being the only Muslim that some people know and are exposed to. So I'm the only Muslim in the workplace that I work in right now. So there will be moments when Trump will tweet something crazy, and they're like, I feel the eyes rolled in my direction, and they say, okay, Aymann, how do you feel? What are the Muslims saying? Tell us what the Muslim answer is to this problem.
And then you pick up the red phone and you find out.
Yeah.
So
like the WhatsApp group that we all, the 1.6 billion. Yeah.
It's like the same reason when they're like, yo, could you tell ISIS to chill? It's like, hold on, I got you, Jordan. Yeah. So there's that problem of being the only Muslim that we are working with. So we not only have to deal with that problem on the outside, but also when we're trying to address and do our own jobs personally. Like, how do we tackle those things when we are the only Muslims reporting on these things? Do we have a responsibility to do it because maybe Bradley or Bob wouldn't be able to? You know, so do we as Muslims have to talk about these things? I don't know. What do you think, Aisha?
You know, it's definitely complicated. Part of this issue of being the quote-unquote only Muslim is that survey after survey has proved that, in large part, people's negative assumptions and bias towards Muslims correlates exactly with whether or not they know any. And as soon as you encounter someone that has had any kind of interaction with the Muslim community or any individual Muslim, whether it's in their school or their workplace or in their neighborhood, you'll see that they themselves manage to question what they assumed about this identity and this faith community, because there's so much diversity of experience, and there is no one central, group chat or really any coherent, quote-unquote Muslim community. And I think something that's also important to consider is the effect that the only Muslim problem has on the production and consumption of news for everyone, whether they're Muslim or not. And when you don't have the experience and narratives of Muslims attached to stories about us, you end up circulating some pretty damaging and harmful biased stereotypes. And the problem with that is this idea of Muslims being an inscrutable, mysterious, inaccessible community is centuries old. That's not something that's a recent development under Trump. That's something that's been around since the time of the Crusades. And you see that maintained still today because reporters tend to shy away from, even when they do go out to interview Muslims, leaving that bias at the door. So they even tell those stories with this idea of, all of the different Orientalist tropes and signifiers that get invoked when they come to sit down with a young Muslim woman. They'll immediately start invoking those. And I don't even think that a lot of them are conscious of doing it. So part of more accurately and effectively telling quote-unquote Muslim stories, and we can get into why even that as a notion is problematic, is improving media literacy both on the side of news production and on the side of news consumption. I think they have to be done in tandem in order for us to be able to get past the conversations and stereotypes and panel topics we've had since 9/11 and before then.
And I think also to kind of add to that, when we're just dissecting the mainstream narrative when it comes to Islam and when it comes to Muslims in the Muslim community, there is this tendency to only talk about Muslims in a political context, right? Yes. So we're either talking about it in a domestic political context, an international political context, the chaos that's happening in the Middle East and elsewhere. And although there's this upward trend of this well-intended new genre of journalism of look at this Muslim doing a normal thing. And I think that's in reaction to just all the horrible coverage that's been happening. So I think the intentions of there is we want to shine quote unquote better light on Muslims, but then it becomes so oversimplified in that sense. And it's because we're not talking about the community in other areas like the arts and film and in medicine and STEM and just all the other amazing things. And this is not something that's only found on the right? This is happening both on the right and on the left. We saw it in the last election campaign when Hillary, the only time she mentioned Muslims in one of the debates, she was like, the Muslim community are our eyes and ears in the war against terrorism. So even though she was trying to counter all the racist rhetoric that was coming from the right, she's still tying the community in a political sense, and therefore I think the Muslim identity has become a politicized identity, yes, where it's very hard to break down those barriers so we can report on the community doing just quote-unquote normal things in a way that's not oversimplified and just quite right condescending.
Picking up on that, I think it's something for people in newsrooms and also then for Muslims and Muslim communities to remember is that Muslims care about more than just the travel ban and immigration. Those aren't simply Muslim issues. They do affect Muslims, but they affect other people. And in addition, Muslims also care about things like police brutality because that affects Muslims too. That affects especially black ones. And so there are other issues that don't get tied to Muslims, and you may not see someone call up a Muslim to get their thoughts on the latest shooting death or a school shooting, but those are things that affect members of the American community, and so also affect Muslims. But then the other thing to think about is just to remind all of ourselves that no one is a monolith, no community is a monolith. And so while it is very important for newsrooms to make sure that there's representation and to make sure that their newsrooms reflect the greater society and the people that are their viewers, it also doesn't just mean that you can pick up one brown person or black person and think, oh, I'm good, because though that does look good on paper, we are not all woke. And just because you are a minority community doesn't mean that you're necessarily going to reflect the views of the marginalized or the people that need their views reflecting and aren't seen in the mainstream. And so I think that has to be part of our thinking, where we think about what does diversity mean and what does having a diverse newsroom and diverse coverage look like.
Yeah, it gets even more complicated because our identities are based on religion, you know? Mm-hmm. And like any religion, it's going to be practiced differently by every single community, and even further, by every single individual, you know? I'm having conversations with Muslims who are practicing Islam in a way that's unrecognizable to me, but, you know, it's kind of hard to suggest who's right, who's wrong, how do we get one Muslim or one writer or one reporter to represent that entire idea that comes when we're talking about like a religion, you know? So I don't know, I'm just kind of curious. Each of us have our own ways of practicing Islam, and I think that's natural when it comes to practicing a religion as expansive as Islam. So do you ever feel any pressure to represent that entire 1.7 billion people on Earth, Malika?
The pressure is there, so I can't deny that it's there, but it's a thing that I have to say, not all communities have to feel that, and so I try to remind myself that I don't have to feel this. It might be there, but it's not something that I have to take on as my own. But that said, it still happens. There'll be times when I do a show featuring guests from a political persuasion that maybe is hesitant to come on our air. I work for Al Jazeera English, and so we're seen as more liberal-leaning, more progressive. Whether or not that's true is up to your own interpretation. So when we have on conservative guests and guests from the Republican Party, there can be a tendency for my coworkers and I to be extra nice, to smile a little bit bigger, make them feel comfortable so that they know that this is a comfortable space, and we are just as professional as other media organizations. Don't think that you're coming into a space that is already antagonistic just because you believe that we don't think the same as you and we don't have the same beliefs. So there is that tendency, there's that weight. But on the whole, that's something that all journalists have to think about. And so keeping that in mind as I do my reporting is something that does play into how I ask my questions and how I present myself and how I make sure that I'm reporting all sides of an issue and of a story so that it's all represented, so that there's no accusations of bias and there's no accusations of unfairness.
And sometimes that pressure comes from our own community, right? So our own community looks at us and they're just like, finally, like, you're gonna get it right, or like, you're one of us. And then you start questioning yourself, okay, like, well, what is getting it right? Because we're not necessarily PR people. I'm not here to make my religion look bad. I'm not trying to convert my viewers, you know what I mean? Or trying to prove to them something about my religion, like as many people want to accuse me. But I think that pressure comes from just decades and decades of misrepresentation and just harmful narratives. And so it's like a double-sided coin. So like first you're dealing with the pressure from the non-Muslim community and what they expect of you and whether they think you can do your job. And they start questioning, like, are you credible as a journalist to report on your own community? Do you have your own biases? And then you have the pressure from the community themselves who expect you to glorify the community. And so when we're talking about tricky subjects, whether it's like, for example, like the domestic violence within the Muslim community, right? There is this extra nuance that we have to be able to provide because we want to tell the right story. We want to give the story justice for the community, but at the same time, we're not here to please one particular party or another. Yeah. So it's hard.
Yeah, it gets even more difficult exactly when you're talking about that because I mean, what I produce, I'm always trying to talk to like both sides of every story, and I'm having these conversations with people who are like pouring out all these negative things that they've experienced in the Muslim community or positive things in the Muslim community, and I'm terrified of like adding fuel to the fire to the xenophobes and the bigots. So one episode of the series that I'm producing, I talked about homosexuality in the Muslim community, and I started with my cousin, and my cousin actually got kicked out of his house when he came out to his parents because they're like very ultra conservative, and they actually wanted to like kill him, and he sensed that. And that's like a huge, difficult thing that we all need to talk about and discuss. But after that episode came out, only the first 15 seconds of that whole 7-minute episode was circulating on Twitter, and just him telling his story about how bad that experience was for his family. And I felt bad. I felt like, you know, I just added that much more pressure to Muslims in my own community for feeling like here's more evidence of our barbarism, you know? And I think that just gets like really complicated and really nuanced for us as forward-facing Muslims. You know, it's we're the ones talking to the world, and whether we want them to or not, they are looking at us and thinking to themselves, "Oh, look, Muslim reporter, Muslim this, Muslim that." So yeah, I don't know. I sometimes feel like some of the questions that come about us and whether or not we're able to do our jobs is whether or not we can be trusted to talk about our communities. So do you think they have a point, Rowaida?
That we can or cannot be trusted? No, I don't think they have a point. Of course, unfortunately, anyone who belongs to a certain group, I think we unfairly get that question the most. It's, you know, no one will ask a black reporter whether they think they can actually talk about like the black community. And I think it's just because the religion or identity has become so stigmatized that that question even exists. So you have to kind of question the premise of the question. And then secondly, I think it's an advantage. So when I'm talking to, a Muslim mother who has faced some sort of Islamophobia by her community, or the fact that you were able to talk to your cousin, I have people in the community that trust me and put their faith in me and have that conversation with me because I understand them. So being able to make that connection on a human level and being able to know that I understand why them talking to me is so difficult places a lot of responsibility to give justice to their story. And I feel like I really felt that when I was talking to the refugee community because over the last year or two with the different travel bans that were coming down, a lot of the refugee community felt very tokenized by mainstream and very let's look at the sadness and the pitfalls and the obstacles of the refugee community, and they kind of get thrown and tossed aside, and here they are trying to grapple and live their lives, and they were able to express certain sentiments to me because they felt like we share something in common. And I think that's a skill set that makes me a better reporter. And I think that's something that, as a reporter of color, is a skill set that my newsroom values. And I think all newsrooms need to value that when they have a diverse community, they're going to be able to tap into a network that your regular mainstream white male reporter is just not going to get.
And I think it's also important to be very honest about the environment and context we're operating in, and everything we've just shared about the challenges about telling stories, whether they're positive or negative, about our community members, other Muslims around the world or domestically. All of those challenges have to do with the fact that for Muslims operating on any level with any kind of public visibility, anything we do or say can and will be used against us. And I think that's the reality we need to be recognizing right now. And the fact is we are operating at a deficit of any openness to giving Muslims a sort of fair and consideration of their three-dimensionality and their humanness. One of the quotes that's always struck with me was, the Muslims being massacred in Myanmar right now, one of them told a reporter that I would love to be seen less as a Muslim and more as a human. And while all of us here at South by Southwest are very appreciably far from the reality that, refugee escaping genocide face, this idea of having to choose to be seen as human first and background or Muslim identity is very real. So there is this value in being conscious of that context when we speak about our issues. I think back to this very prominent actor in Hollywood who self-identifies as a non-practicing Muslim American, and in a New Yorker profile about his new movie, he said, quote, I'd love to tell the stories about those of us who don't go to mosques, who are normal Americans. And again, reproducing this logic of Muslim identity being something that's inherently incompatible with a normal American life. I mean, the example he used to be to provide the contrast with a mosque-going Muslim was the type that goes out to eat ice cream. And I thought, well, my family's both. So why is it that we have to choose? And those contradictions are decades old. We're now in the third presidency of my lifetime in which I have to say that being a normal American that enjoys ice cream is not incompatible with being a Muslim. And when we talk about the challenges we face in telling quote-unquote Muslim stories, the main challenge is that it's going to be viewed through the lens of being a Muslim story. And that is a unique challenge. Stories about white Americans aren't seen through the lens of being stories about the white American community. And what is the white American community talking? What is their statement on the latest white American gun violence? And that the absence of that burden is really the subtext of everything we've shared so far. And I think back to what you said, that Hillary Clinton only mentioned us in our proximity to being terrorist cell informants. I mean, it was almost verbatim the same thing that Trump said. And it reminds me of the fact that the prevailing attitudes towards the Muslim ban changed only in the course of Trump's insistence on the Muslim ban. So it took a character as unlikable as Trump for American survey respondents to be like, you know what, maybe a Muslim ban isn't a good idea if this guy likes it. So thank you, Donald Trump, for finally making Islamophobia unfashionable, because it has taken decades. And the reason he was elected in the first place is because these media narratives that we've all been referencing, that we have been trying to resist in our work and elsewhere, were the reason why people have been able to maintain such hostility towards us and our communities, that the first person to propose banning us entirely from this country could easily win a landslide. And I remember when he started campaigning on that platform, that was the day in 2015 I said, this is the man that's going to win the presidency. And part of the reason I avoid working in news media now and switch to Hollywood, which is not far better, is because no one believed me. And I thought, so this is the class of people, and it is a class tasked with explaining the news and politics to this country, and they are so woefully blind to the realities that Americans face, to the realities of brewing hostility that's been maintained in large part through their institutions over the last few years, that's not an institution I have that much hope for. So I'm really curious to hear your all's experience as people who are still fighting the good fight and reporting and working in journalism. I'd love to hear you guys talk about where you go next from that, because I'm impressed that you're not tired yet, honestly.
We are tired.
So 2 quick points I wanted to raise off the back of what you were saying. One, you weren't alone in knowing that Trump was going to win the election. I went to the RNC with my teammates, my coworkers and I, and we left that. This is a Republican National Convention in Cleveland, and everyone was really, really sweet to us and really nice to us, especially when they heard we were from Al Jazeera. They were super polite. They would bend over backwards to make sure that we were feeling welcomed and spoke to the voices we needed for our coverage. And then you juxtapose that with going into the stadium at the end of the day, and it's this huge, this is the basketball arena. It's humongous. It's filled with people who are delegates and also supporters. And they're chanting, "Make America Great Again," which is just interesting, if only it weren't for the fact that they're chanting it after someone says, "Ban all Muslims." Mm-hmm. And then you hear the chants from the audience, and they wave the signs that say, "Make America Great Again." And then you had another speaker, Newt Gingrich, got up and said, "We need to institute a test for Muslims to see who is and who isn't. We need to institute this religious test." And then you had the cheers, "Make America Great Again." And my coworkers and I are just kind of looking at each other thinking, this is bizarre. Do they not know? They see us here, and they're nice to us in the mornings. Where does that disconnect come from? So we left that knowing that this was going to be the outcome of the election, so you weren't alone in that. But the point I really wanted to raise from what you were saying, because you're talking about the lens through which we see things in the media, and I will let you guys in on a little secret, as someone who went to journalism school, objectivity is a lie.
Yeah.
And I think the sooner that we all come to recognize that, the better off we will be. What objectivity has come to mean is that the status quo is normal. And the status quo in this country, let's all be honest, is usually older, it's white, it's male. Oftentimes it's Judeo-Christian, but that can change. But it is not me, and it's not really the people on this panel. We are not the status quo. And so if the gatekeepers to information and to stories and storytelling or that status quo, if what they think is the norm is represented, then that is objectivity. Whereas what needs to happen, reality of what objectivity and what we should be striving for in the media is recognize that you have a bias, recognize where you come from and that it informs how you see things. And pretending that it doesn't is ignorant. And so the sooner you recognize that, then you can make sure that you're reporting the side that you agree with secretly or not so secretly, and the side that you don't agree with. You're making sure you get all sides of that story, and that will give you a better offering to your public versus saying, this is the norm and not including the other parts because you're striving to be objective.
Yeah, and I really want to kind of drop off your ice cream part because I felt like that was very important. But I think we see this come up very often when we discuss the issues of radicalization, right? When we talk about radicalization of someone who happens to be brown and proclaims to be of the Muslim faith versus talking about radicalization of someone who is white and proclaims to be of a white supremacy faith. And I think an example that really continues to haunt me was immediately after the San Bernardino shooting, when the landlord kind of opened the door of the guy's apartment before, this was immediately after, emotions were pretty high, we didn't know a lot of information, and then you just had swarms of media with their cameras kind of just going through his apartment. And I remember standing in my newsroom very vividly, just watching this happen on one of our many screens, and then one of the anchors was and all that's left is a Quran and a prayer rug. And I was just genuinely appalled, so appalled, because I have a Quran and a prayer rug in my desk, in my newsroom, right? I have one at home, I have one in my car, everywhere. All Muslims do. It's normal. It's so normal. And the fact that they were making an association to those items, just tangible items to the tools of a terrorist, I think hurt me on such a personal level and also disgusted me as a journalist, because it was just so poorly done in making these associations that were so false and really was implicitly targeting and accusing an entire faith. It's look, if you have these, you're probably going to go down this route. Right. And so this idea of you need to be a non-practicing Muslim, right? That's a particular person. If you do go to the mosque, if you do read the Quran, God forbid you tell them you pray 5 times a day, right? Mm-hmm. They're seeing that being a practicing Muslim doesn't mean that you just want to, be loyal to your faith. You want to be a good person. You're trying to seek out certain values and morals and ideals. It's seen as you're going to this scary, dark, deep path to radicalization, and therefore, the more devout you become, the worse you are as a person. And I think that was really reflected in that moment on national TV in people's homes, and I think that's just a prime example of really just poor quality journalism. And I think a Muslim journalist could have spotted that and been this is bad.
I agree. I mean, they were showing sensitive personal information, social security cards. That was an example of awful. I mean, that should be taught in journalism schools as an example of what not to do. But I wanted to get back to, this idea of how this association made between Islam and some dark side, right? And what the effect that association has had on the American imagination and its inability to ever recognize Muslims as victims of violence, only ever perpetrators or aggressors, and what that does. And I think back to a case that happened in this state, in fact, where a 6-year-old boy with Down syndrome in a classroom, his teacher accused him of being a terrorist and called the police on him. Because, remember, we've been living, even before Trump, in an era of see something, say something. And what that did was conscripted white people into America's security apparatus as surveillance. And what the effect that has had in producing a very aggressive paranoia, the Muslims have become the target of that paranoia. And as we all know, the white imagination can be incredibly violent, whether it's imagining a gun in a young black boy's hand or imagining a 6-year-old boy with Down syndrome is a radicalized terrorist. That's what this teacher said. In an interview, she said that she thought he was saying the words bomb over and over again. And I think back to, Ahmed, who brought his clock that he made, and he was excited to show off to his teacher, look what I did. And immediately the teacher called the police, and he was sent without his parents being notified to being detained for 3 days. This is a young boy. And again, these are stories that happened long before Trump. And anyone working in media needs to reckon with what the public imagination, where it's at right now, because the media has been responsible for producing it. And that is a reckoning I've yet to see happen at the level it needs to happen, because I think we're all familiar with the ways in which the right mobilizes xenophobic ideas and bigotry, but we're not as good at identifying how self-identified liberal circles reproduce that bias. And I think a lot of the ways that I've personally encountered it, because we could talk for hours about how it operates on an institutional and public level, is that people are often surprised to know that I'm, a practicing Muslim that has no qualms about being that and an American. And often the surprise is rooted in this idea, oh, but you seem so normal. And I mean, those are the words I've been hearing since I was in school, and I'm very aware of the ways in which I'm sheltered and escape a lot of anti-Muslim violence by not necessarily immediately reading as visibly Muslim. And most of the targets of anti-Muslim violence, which has only risen dramatically and continues to do so, have been women who wear the headscarf, have been immigrants, darker-skinned women, Bengali women especially. One was set on fire in Queens. I mean, this is daily violence. We think back to the 3 young Muslims that were shot in their apartment in North Carolina. So what we're talking about is not abstract. It manifests in daily violence. And that is something I hope we can all sit with for a minute and appreciate, because all of what we've been discussing so far, it all links across this spectrum that, can go from an ignorant moment in a newsroom to someone attacking another Muslim. And I think back to the mosque I grew up going to in Ohio that had been attacked constantly throughout my years of growing up there, as did the one I attended in Kentucky, as did about 2 mosques a week have been set on fire on average last year. And again, that violence has only risen. So when we talk about being a Muslim media member, I can't divorce that from being a Muslim in America, period, right now, and the ways in which that is a very vulnerable identity. And I think we're all quite lucky to have the careers that we have and oftentimes be sheltered from that violence, but I know we have family members who aren't. And there's a great deal of urgency, I feel, and a responsibility, to get back to what you asked us earlier, in grappling with the status of the American imagination right now with the hope of somewhat advancing it, because that's what we need to ensure that all people here have access to a life of safety and dignity. And I don't feel that paranoia or anxiety are, useful emotions, and we all know the ways in which they can be politically mobilized, and I do believe we're better than that. And by we, I mean Americans.
Yeah, that started to sound like that's not just our responsibility as Muslim reporters anymore. That just sounds like our responsibility as Americans,
Yes.
people, members of this society. So we do have 15 minutes left, and I wanted to give the audience an opportunity to ask us some questions. So if anybody wants to go, I think we could just form a line or one at a time to stand to this microphone so we can hear you. Cool.
There's the mic right there.
Yeah.
Go for it.
So I was going to ask a really depressing question, but I decided not to. So I'm super excited. You guys have all been here to see it, that meditation is becoming something that's trending, right? But if you are a person who has been doing meditation forever, then 10 years ago, if you suggested to meditate to somebody, they would think you're just a weird hippie and write that off and roll their eyes. But I think that with prayer, it's very similar to meditation. So do you guys feel like right now is a really great time to kind of reposition prayer and spending that time every day as something that's like, this is the ultimate peaceful religion?
I love this question because it gets back to what we were saying about Islam having the worst PR. It's not entirely our fault, by the way. And this is a question of branding, right? And I'm very hesitant to accept the notion that I have to rebrand Islam because that means ceding the idea that I have to apologize for any of it, or that it's something that needs some kind of corrective. Because that's a narrative that actually gained a great deal of traction over the last few years in liberal circles through the group of self-identified new atheists, Sam Harris, Christopher Dawkins, Hitchens, etc., who rebranded virulent Islamophobia as, intellectual inquiry and social critique, and that became very popular, even reaching, the founder of Twitter, @Jack, right? So in answer to your question, there's part of me that agrees prayer is very meditative. That's why I enjoy praying 5 times a day as a Muslim, and I enjoy those, intermittent opportunities throughout the day to do so. But if I have to call my prayer, or salat, as it's known in Islam, meditation in order for me to be able to do so, what that does, that doesn't make Muslims safer in this country. It means we're ceding ground to those who have the most hostile attitudes about our faith and who we are. And it's all about, our responsibility now, or the one that I feel most urgently, is not ceding any more ground to those who assume the worst of us, and not accepting any acceptability of me personally that is dependent on abandoning or throwing under the bus other Muslims. Because I know there are advantages I have in moving through certain creative, liberal, wealthy, white American circles, and I don't hold that acceptance so dear that I would want to abandon or make things even more difficult for, the immigrant woman from Pakistan who maybe speaks with an accent and wears a headscarf, or the Syrian refugee who, isn't hip to the latest trends in de-ethnicized yoga practices and meditation. And we need to be very conscious of the ways in which how we operate make people safer or unsafer, and whether we're letting really damaging ideas about us be inherited, even if they benefit us individually. And that's the same problem I had with the actor I mentioned earlier, who enjoys the attention and acceptability he's receiving, but it's always at the expense of those who practice Islam differently from him. And my goal has always been, I think we all share that, is the greater room for accepting the multiplicity of our faith identity and the diversity of experience within it, the better and safer we all are, whether it's an LGBTQ Muslim or whether it's a non-Muslim American.
I will say that said, while I agree with all of those points, when I do see a meditation room at an airport or an office, I'm always secretly cheering, because it means I can go in there and pray and kind of be, have my seclusion and not be looked at weird. So both points.
Wrong, that it's less like rebranding and more like your opportunity to start getting more education. So the more that people get educated about something, the more they accept it.
Sure, like a non-denominational prayer room would be great for a lot of spaces.
Yeah, which many like MSAs and groups have a very hard time in building to begin with because of the anti-Muslim sentiment. But yeah.
Yep.
Good.
Okay. You talked a little bit about like objectivity, and you also mentioned that other people might see where you guys are working as leaning left, and I don't know anybody who is Muslim and works on the right in journalism.
Mm-hmm.
And I was just wondering, is there anybody with a voice there?
Oh, yes.
There's a few.
It's a very lucrative career pathway.
Really?
Oh, yeah.
I would be curious to hear like the challenges that you hear from that. Like what is, that's kind of like the dark side?
There's nothing the right loves more than a Muslim face saying anti-Muslim things.
Yeah.
And so if you want speaking gigs that offer you $200,000 per gig, and they're paid by church groups, by police departments. Actually, the NYPD has regularly hosted anti-Muslim speakers, and there's always the good old stand by Fox News, which has led to the establishment of thriving careers for a number of fringe lunatics that no Muslim subscribes to, but are hailed as official clerics and representatives of our faith.
So that's it. It's that we'll have the token Muslim in the newsroom so that we can say that we're diverse.
I think sometimes, I will say, I'll put it out there, I have friends who are libertarian, I have friends that are Republican, and they're also Muslim, and they're also brown. I don't know any black ones. But, so they exist. They're not in the media, but they are strategists. They are in the party. A lot of them were part of the Never Trump camp. So, they were just as disappointed as people on the left were with the election. But they're there because they ascribe to some of the fiscal ideals of the party. So they definitely do exist.
Yeah, they definitely do. There's both. I think there's the crazy spokespeople that we probably are not friends with, and then there are just like regular producers. And because at the end of the job, like at the end of the day, being a Muslim in journalism, period, whether it's left journalism or right journalism, is so difficult, and I think is such a barrier within itself and very hard to break into. So some of them, our colleagues, like do great work and don't necessarily feel fully represented by everything the quote-unquote right media subscribes to, but they're there.
Yeah, I don't want to name any names either, so I'm going to avoid doing that entirely. But there's if you think about how media works and how people consume media and how people make money from media, it's all about clicks, and getting eyes and getting shares. So there's a huge appetite for seeing a Muslim woman make the case for why we should ban headscarves around the world, or why the Muslims should be supporting someone like Trump, which there's like 3 or 4 pieces written like that from all these different Muslim journalists. So I think contrarian news in itself is very popular. So like Aisha said, it could be very, very lucrative.
And also the fact that it goes back to the basic idea that Muslims are not a monolith. Like before pre-Trump, there were Muslims who, identified as Republicans. And the first Bush election, majority of Muslims voted Republican. So the political spectrum is pretty diverse. So sometimes they identified with it maybe 10, 15 years ago and kind of still do today.
Yeah, someone in my immediate family voted for Trump.
I too. Yeah.
It's awkward at dinner.
Thank you.
Hey.
Hi, I'm a writer and from Austin, Texas. I also freelance. Austin South Asian is a small newspaper. And I just want to say that I agree with you about, ending up in that defensive position because there's really no one like you. And even in Austin, to pick up a badge, it's all kinds of people in the room, and then there's me. If I have to pick up the badge by the bar, oh my God, everyone's turning. What's she doing at the bar?
Wow.
So, and I end up answering a lot of questions to my friends who dare to ask. Sometimes I feel that I wish there was a book called Islam 101 for Dummies or something, but you all have a platform because sharing all the responsibilities gets hard. But if you had like 5 bullets to give all my friends all over the world, who do not dare to ask, who don't have time to read a book, could you just think up of 4, just 5 things that you come across someone with a headscarf, that's the first thing you don't do. Stuff like that. Help me and help.
It's interesting. I was actually just having this conversation with a friend of mine because someone on Facebook had asked, help me, give me cultural tips on how to deal with Muslims. And I was like, oh, well, duh, tell that person, don't necessarily assume that a Muslim woman will shake your hand. Right. Some will, some won't. And my friend pushed back, who's also Muslim, and he said, this question is flawed, and this is why this is not a good question, and let me answer that instead, because we're not a culture, we're a religion, and how that plays out and how that is then interpreted in so many different ways. I shake hands, I will shake your hand. I can't necessarily assume that the next person who wears a scarf will. So it's just so hard to have a blanket to do's and to don'ts. If you were raised in America, you might come at things differently than if you were raised in Malaysia. So just ask if you have a question. But even saying that, and even in the just asking, I am open to questions and I'm open to people being curious about my lifestyle. But Google is there for a reason, and it's super helpful. And so if you have a real question, feel free to pop it in there, do a little bit of research, and then come to me with that educated question with, this is what I'm thinking, I'm confused about this. But basic things like, do you shower in this? I mean, it's 2018, guys. No, I don't shower in this. So I have such trouble with that question, but I like it. I like it.
I feel like I have very similar sentiment towards that question, but I think just like look at us as humans. Like you wouldn't touch a random person's hair. Like don't touch black women's hair. Don't touch Muslim women's hijab. Like it's just like don't touch anyone. People don't want to be touched. So I think like we kind of really need to bring it back to the basics before we even dive into like the do's and the don'ts. If you're struggling, then I think that's more of like a go meet more people like skill set and less of like how do I deal with like a Muslim person, because we're just like everybody else in that regard.
Yeah, and I would just ask them to try to rationalize the fact that there are famous Muslims, you know, and there are like athletes, and there are other Muslims who are very front-facing that aren't journalists and aren't fitting into whatever category that you require for them to be a Muslim person. So if they can, before assuming something about a Muslim person, group all of those different people into that same box, that would be the only way that they can make any assumption.
Football is our religion.
Yeah, yeah.
It is.
But going back to like the new atheists and how they talk about they've sort of disguised their Islamophobia as a form of rationalism or an ideology. What was the word they used? Curiosity? I forget. Intellectualism. That's the word. Anyways, but every time a Muslim doesn't fall into the category that they've chosen for all of Islam, they then make qualifiers. So then they say, oh, well, that person is this kind of Muslim, or that kind of person is a different kind of Muslim. So I think if all Muslims together represent Islam as a whole, they all need to fit into the same box. If you're going to say the Quran commands them to kill people, by rationality, by basic rationality, all Muslims who are around the world should be trying to kill people, which is insane to even think about or even to consider. So I think the only thing I would tell people is to think of all the Muslims in the entire world, and not just the bad ones or not just the good ones, and see whether or not they fit into a hypothetical umbrella. And if they don't, then you're probably being ignorant. I don't know.
Yeah. And I guess I would just recommend two quick things. Agree with Aymann that the fact that there's 2 billion of us should maybe lead them to question their own questions. And the other thing, the thing I always got asked growing up in Kentucky, and even it's a question I've encountered elsewhere, a lot of people don't know that Allah is just the Arabic word for God. Mm-hmm. So Arabic-speaking Christians pray to Allah also. And there isn't, I think, I encounter a surprising number of people who think that that is a separate entity that's specific to Islam. It's a generic Abrahamic God.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
This is a little too high. I'm just going to talk. Okay.
Sure.
So I wanted to thank you guys for coming. First of all, I was really excited about the panel, and I really agreed with like everything that was said, because like I grew up in Texas, and I would write editorials to my teachers about why I'm not violent, why Muslims aren't violent. After every terrorist attack, I'd put a Facebook status that said like, I'm sorry that like this is happening, and like I'm at a point now where I know that I don't have to do that, and that is a journey of like fighting internalized like racism and hatred that I know a lot of Muslims are still going through. But when you get to the other side and you know that you don't have to do that, you don't have to apologize, you don't have to like say you're like, I don't know, pro-human rights, like you don't have to make that distinction, how do you begin to navigate spaces where people still expect you to do that?
Good question.
That's a great question. I think I can definitely relate to being on that other side, having had a similar school experience. And my recommendation would be to recognize the absurdity of their assumptions and don't waste your energy explaining, as you described, you're no longer interested in doing. But, take the chance to laugh at the question. It's not, I know we maybe grew up with very strict, rules for how to be respectful and treat people with manners, and that's part of our faith as well. But you're allowed to recognize the stupidity of what someone's asking of you. And when you do that, when you observe that, when you, demonstrate that affect, you're effectively communicating to the people around you that assumption, that question is in fact absurd. And that reaches the goal a lot more effectively than paragraph-long Facebook statuses explaining why we're not all the same, just like Westboro Church doesn't represent Christianity, Al-Qaeda doesn't represent Islam. I mean, there's a litany of cliche, rote, very familiar sentences that I'm sure we've all seen versions of written versions of on our social media profiles. And the fact is it's easier, more refreshing, and genuinely more effective simply to say that that's silly and dumb and not a good, use of anyone's time. And when you do that, that is an educating tactic, because that also, like I said, communicates that those are not valid assumptions, and there is such a thing as a dumb question. And observing that is also the act of sharing knowledge. So I would encourage you to do that.
Yeah, and just to add on to that, I think when we look at our own community, in the Muslim community, like this idea of like, do we condemn a terrorist attack? It's still a struggle. I think for us as a community, there's really no right answer. You still have a huge portion of the community that's just like yes, like we still want to condemn it because we feel like we need to continue to preach to the choir. Just a couple weeks ago, I was interviewing a series of mosques in Kansas and Omaha that undergone some sort of like it was graffitied or broken into and things of that sort. So I'm talking to them about it, and every single mosque that I went to, they were all just like, but it's okay, and like, we're fine, and nobody got hurt, and like we don't blame anyone, and like we love it here, and we host interfaith events. Like there was not one mosque that didn't host an interfaith event or just like an open house event to continue to invite people. And I thought to myself, like, God, that must be so exhausting that like your mosques are being set on fire and they're still hosting open house events for people who, quite frankly, are not going to change their mind. To come in and to ask questions. And so I asked them, I was like, isn't that exhausting? Don't you guys want to move forward? And I think it's so embedded with them that they want to prove that they're good people because they feel like this is the only way they know how to fight the good fight. And so if you're at a place where you want to laugh off someone's question, then I think that's fair and you can make that decision. Again, like Muslims are not a monolith, and there are going to be some Muslims who want to do the repetitive condemning. They want to continue to host like open house events. Like my mother is like one of them. My mom, I remember seeing her. She's the person who goes through the Facebook comments and responds to all the racist people and just like defending like Islam. And I'm like, Mama, like, stop. One, this is like bad for your like mental health, and two, like you're tagging me in all of them, and it's a little ridiculous. Like I cannot handle it. And she's just like, no, like I have to do something. Like this is me standing up for like 1.6 billion Muslims. And I had to be like, you know what? If she's okay mentally, and if she's emotionally like not being upset about it, and this is her way of doing the right thing or a good thing, then you kind of have to just. I let her do it because we're all not going to fight the fight the same way.
Yeah. I have one more thing to add. While I philosophically agree with all of that, I do end up going in the comments and responding to everybody.
You should meet my mom.
No, because I grew up in a community that was, when I went to high school, I was the only Muslim kid that I knew, and they called me Muslim kid, and I just got used to it, So I was playing ambassador since I was 14, and I got used to answering dumb questions. So I guess maybe I'm just conditioned to be more patient than I need to be, but at the same time, I think it helps other people who aren't necessarily Muslim and also not necessarily bigots either, who genuinely don't understand. Like they have questions like, how come I don't see marches against ISIS, but I see marches against police brutality or that kind of thing. Even though those marches exist and they could just type that question into Google, it'll sometimes help if you're scrolling through that thread and then you see one person throw a link in saying, hey, here's the pictures from that march that you missed. It makes me feel better knowing that information is out there, and it's gonna make all those people in that thread before me look like idiots. But and I'd rather see that comment there than not, and that's why I am constantly punishing myself and putting myself in those spaces so that I can be the person to be like, if your idea of a Muslim doesn't include me, then maybe you should re-evaluate your label of Islam.
Totally. I mean, I will add quickly, the last thing is that having that kind of adolescence did make me an expert on my own faith, and I do credit those terrible, dumb questions in affirming my choice to be a Muslim today, because I ended up going back to reread the Quran multiple times. I was like,
same.
All right, I'm on board.
Thank you.
Hey, everybody. So please correct any of my assumptions that are wrong as soon as I say them. But my understanding is that Islam, I don't need that. My understanding is that Islam is a lot more than just a religion. I mean, the Quran is written in a language that should be dead, except for the fact that it's like still used by 1.6 billion people. It's a banking system, it's an economy, it's not just an economy, it's a political approach that many countries use. And I guess there's so many other things that I'm not even thinking of right now. And the four of you spend your time fighting with idiots. Oh, and it's been going through a revolution for the last 7 years, because it's like the old style battling with the new style. And just, there's so much happening right now, and you spend all of your time fighting with idiots. So when you cure Islamophobia or fix it or destroy it, what are the Islam-focused areas that you'd be excited to write about and to share with the world, and like the other things that are just happening?
That's a great question. I appreciate that very much. I would love to write about Islamic art. I think geometry and math had played a really big role in Islamic art, and I've just only been only recently, like in the last year, studying like Moorish art and like South Italian and North Moroccan and all that art, and it's blowing my mind, and I'm mad at myself for not diving into it earlier. But yeah, that's what I would like to write about. But to talk about your sentiment earlier, yeah, Islam is. And I think this goes back to like all religions, I think they all sort of have an influence on how you're dealing with money and how you deal with charity and how you deal with government. And I don't think that's something that Islam introduced to the world, but I do think that all of these governments and all of these different countries are approaching the same texts and the same things differently. So when people are examining these texts and saying, well, look at Saudi Arabia, they're doing this, I think they should also look at like places like Turkey or places that are also using the same texts to try to understand how they deal with economy and how they deal with like foreign policy themselves. But yeah.
And it's also true that there's no one country that, no matter how they might be described or self-identify, can be accurately described as a Muslim or Islamic country. It's a inaccurate trope to begin with, really. I mean, there are many different politically shaping forces, primarily capitalism and geography and resource distribution, that have a great deal more to do with how a country chooses to create its self-identity and myths about itself. Same way America describes itself as a Christian country.
I'll put a plug in for fashion, because it is, you see more and more articles about it now, the rise of hijabi and turbanistas, fashion bloggers on Instagram especially, but there's a market there, there's creativity there, and Americans aren't first at it, even though on Instagram it might look like it. Malaysia and Indonesia are some of the most fashionable, stylish Muslim women that you'll ever meet, and those stories of just how they're impacting that industry, fascinating.
And I would just plug in literature and poetry, just because it has a huge influence on Islam and Islamic history. The way the Quran is written, it has like this rhythm to it, and I think that's just, I would love to deep dive after I solve Islamophobia, hopefully.
Next week. Thank you.
Thanks for your question.
Yeah, I think it's a really good point, in that it's not as maybe sexy or as easy to get people to watch a show about just general education as is something that's a little more controversial, right? But like even the descriptions over there, who's afraid, focuses on Islamophobia and ... It would be great to just see more education about, hey, this is what Islam is, the different faces of Islam, just for the purpose of that education, not looking at Islam in terms of how other people react to Muslims, right? So that's, again, maybe not as interesting or newsworthy or entertainment worthy, but yeah. I like the fact that Aisha, you said that there is such a thing as a stupid question. So I'm not sure if I'm about to ask one right now. But the Miss Abdelaziz, I wasn't sure I was going to mispronounce your first name, so sorry. You made the comment, I think, earlier about there was a non-practicing Muslim who basically said, hey, I'm not like those other crazies, I'm a normal American, right? And you took offense to that. And maybe I misunderstood something you said a minute ago, but you were talking about Muslims that were on the far right, and you said there's the crazy and then there's the regular, right? So my question is, like, if you think about really extreme Muslims, let's say ISIS, people say, let's kill gays, people with really super extreme ideas, right? Do you think of them as crazy, or do you just think of them as normal in a different context? Because I'm sure they also go out and get ice cream with their families, you know, just like you do, right? So what is like crazy versus normal, and who should we be calling crazy? And I'm kind of curious, do you view those people as crazy, or are they just normal but just a different face of Islam?
I think if we can apply that same question to white supremacists, I think maybe we can find a solution for Muslims.
It applies in a lot of different religions,
right.
a lot of different, right? It's like, who gets to say who's crazy and who's normal, right?
Well, it's a question of authority and ownership, whether we have to own ISIS. And the primary victims of ISIS are other Muslims. So this constant back and forth in trying to establish what's fringe and what's not in order to assert our identities as Muslims, because I think we're all have been put in a position of being to some degree representative and grappling with the burdens and responsibilities of that representation in the context that does ask us that very same question.
I think you misunderstood my question. It's not whether they're fringe or not. My question was just, do you think of them as crazy, right? Because there's some other people that are way left of you that may think of you as crazy. That was really my question. Of course they're fringe. There's fringe in every religion. There's fringe on the left. There's fringe on the right. There's so many different faces, whether it's Judaism or Christianity or Islam or whatever, right? I was just kind of curious, since you didn't like certain people calling you crazy and they're normal, do you think of them as crazy, or do you think of them just as normal but in a different context, right? I mean, even Hitler played with kids and got ice cream, right? So
right.
That was my question. Yeah, sorry.
No worries. Thank you for clarifying. Well, I won't say crazy because crazy is an ableist slur. So what I will say instead is that the numbers are relevant to answering this question. And just numerically, those fringes are fringe because they don't take up the same proportion, you know? And that's why they can't be accurately taken as representatives. And if the word crazy is in reference to what animates those groups and what activates people who do get ice cream with their kids to subscribe to an ideology of violence, then we need, I think we can all agree that crazy is not the right word, but it's really just a very classic universal human fallibility to emotional and political manipulation in the context of extreme violence and economic precarity. These are areas that have been being bombed by the countries we pay taxes in for years, and so the fact that insurgency groups have sprung up out of these power vacuums that have arisen after wars is a better answer to the question I think you're asking than the idea of whether I personally call anyone crazy, which is honestly a word and a judgment call I avoid making. But I do appreciate the fact that at 27 I'm still being asked the same thing I was being asked as a high schooler, which is, what's your relationship to the terrorists?
Yeah, and another thing about what makes Islam specifically a little bit more different than like Catholicism, where there's an intermediary between a practitioner and God. We don't really have a pope. In the Quran, it recommends Muslims to be closer to God by teaching themselves and understanding things better. So really, when it comes down to it, every Muslim is responsible for understanding their own faith, and we are judged on our intention. So really, it's no Muslim's job to decide who's Muslim and who isn't, and it's none of our jobs to decide who's crazy and who isn't. I think what our responsibilities are as Americans is to just be American and live life as best as we could and help. And I think why I chose to get into media was because I never saw other Muslims in media, and I felt like I had a responsibility because I was the only Muslim that I knew when I was growing up. So to answer that question, I do, like you said, there is a context there, and these are regions that have been bombed for a very, very long time, since like the 70s and 80s, and these are bombs that we're paying for with our tax dollars. So when it comes to responsibility, we can't really blame Muslims who are growing up because they pray in the same direction. I think we really need to understand where these bombs are coming from, why these people might be incentivized to go on these rampages, and try to understand it as a human fault and not necessarily a fault in someone reading a book and getting the wrong impression,
Right, because that would be a very superficial analysis.
But thanks for the question, though. Appreciate it. I think we have one more, and then we have to wrap it up. Oh, I'm sorry. We are 15 minutes over, actually. Dude, thank you, everybody, for coming and hanging out and asking these awesome questions. Thank you to the panelists for being so smart and responsive. And I hope to see you guys soon. I'll be hanging out right outside if anybody wants to talk a little bit longer.
Yeah.
Thank you, everybody.